From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
We finally got a bit of rain, but soil specialists say it's not enough to save this year's crops, and next year's could be in danger too. Plus, it may be clean, but more and more Kansans don't want this sort of energy in their backyard. The latest ban on solar. But first, bridging the gap from dangerous to safe for your car with a multi-million-dollar bill. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. The state says more than 1,200 bridges in the state are rated in poor condition right now. But a multi-million-dollar infusion this week is designed to repair and replace the worst of them before something tragic happens, as we've seen. KAKE's Jackson Overstreet explains.
This bridge just north of Belle Plaine in Sumner County is busy on a Thursday with a steady flow of traffic. While it is functioning, it is not in the best shape, according to the state of Kansas.
Kansas has over 1,000 bridges in poor condition, and nearly 4,000 are weight restricted, meaning they can't support modern freight movement.
This bridge is one of 35 across the state that will now be replaced thanks to over $45 million in state and federal funds. Governor Laura Kelly and the Kansas Department of Transportation announced the recipients of this grant money Thursday in Dodge City.
These bridges are essential to getting people and goods where they need to go. And yet almost 5,000 of those bridges are 75 years or older.
With the added money from the federal infrastructure bill a few years ago, KDOT is able to double what it is giving out when it comes to bridge repair, expanding one of the major priorities of the Ike infrastructure program that the state passed back in 2020.
Local bridges obviously play a critical role to our state's commerce and agricultural economy. And when you compare the number of bridges against our state's population, Kansas has the distinction of having more bridges per capita than any state in the nation.
And state lawmakers say replacing these bridges is vital, especially when it comes to connecting rural communities throughout Kansas.
They foster economic growth and they ensure the safety of our citizens.
And joining us today to take a look at this and other topics, we have State Representative Troy Waymaster, a Republican from Bunker Hill, and Diane Leffler, the opinion editor of the Wichita Eagle, as well as State Representative John Carmichael, a Wichita Democrat. And we've got a lot of issues there, but as we look at the bridges question and the extra money coming in, we've known for a while. I did a story with the Department of Transportation a couple of years ago about problems with the bridges in the state. We've known for a while that this is an issue, and they were, a few bridges a year. This helps, but even so, we've got a lot more to go.
Yeah, we do, actually. And this has been going on, as you mentioned, for many, many years. In the Appropriations Committee, we always have an update from the Department of Transportation. And 7 years ago, they were talking about how many bridges we had that were rated in poor condition. And that was one of the focuses when we were actually developing the Ike Transportation Plan, was having a focus on bridges. Now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, that additional dollars coming into the state from the federal government is only going to expedite the completion of those bridges that we've known for quite some time that have been in poor condition. On the other side, then the budget this last year, we put about $215 million aside to draw down more federal money from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And actually, we just had our first advisory committee meeting on Wednesday to kind of go through the details for our counties and our cities to have infrastructure needs that could actually draw down further dollars from the federal government under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, one thing that we did talk about, because we had the announcement the exact same day that we had the committee meeting, was hopefully we're not doubling up, where the governor made the announcement of basically $42.3 million going to local bridges, and then they'll be trying to submit an application for the bipartisan infrastructure law that we're going to try to draw down from the federal government. So we're going to have to be careful on when we're reviewing the applications. But as you mentioned before, this has been a long time coming and something we needed to address.
And certainly, Diane, you and I both, being members of the media, have covered when we've had some major bridge disasters around the country, and we don't want that in Kansas.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at these bridges, you know, the bottom may be all messed up, but the part up top where the cars are, it's okay. So
Simple analysis of that.
But you know, you
The
can.
smell of sarcasm in the morning.
but yeah, I mean, you know, you and I both know that we've covered this how many times, and the number never seems to change. It never gets smaller. We got to do something more than we're doing, and you know, I mean, we went through a long period of time when a lot of money was diverted from roads and highways to pay for other budget priorities, and we got to, you know, we got a lot of catch up to do.
You'll hear no disagreement here. In fact, during the Brownback administration, there was a point in time where you could see through the bridges out on I-70, out around Hayes and Russell. There were holes you could see all the way to the ground. Yes.
I might be a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't know if you see holes.
I've got the pictures. I'll be glad to send them to
Like
you.
I said, I mean, it was a long time coming.
There was holes in the decking that were literally holes all the way through. But at any rate, the point of it is, the problem's been here long before the Brownback administration. It didn't help when we diverted funds that were supposed to go to highways to perhaps tax cuts or other budgetary priorities. But it's good that we're moving on this, and I commend Troy and his committees and the work that they've done. I mean, some of these bridges are now at 80-20 federal match, 20% our money, 80% federal money. Let's take advantage of this because we've got a lot of catching up to do. It's not just highway bridges too. We have situations where wildland firefighting is impeded because the township bridges are in such bad shape, the fire engine can't cross them and they have to drive miles out of the way to get to the fire. So we need to spend our money.
Well, when we had the discussion about it, when we were doing the different sessions throughout the state, when we were trying to craft the new transportation plan, it was the main bridges that were in dire need were the ones that were off system.
Right.
Your local county, township
And I think what
bridges.
we're seeing here is an emphasis in what we just saw in that piece on a lot of the off-system bridges.
Yes.
Exactly what you're talking about, and that work has to be done because those are vital lifelines for the people who live on the other side of the creek.
Well, just like Representative Francis said,
Yeah.
you know, it's economic development.
Right.
And economics is not going anywhere. We're going to cover it many a time on this episode. Speaking of money, the Marion City Police Chief is facing a demand for a lot of it. A reporter with the Marion County Record has filed the first federal lawsuit to come out of that raid of the paper's newsroom. Cake's Nick Nelson explains what she's suing over.
The video seen around the world shows the moments police raided both the Marion County Record offices and the home of the paper's co-owner, Joanne Meyer, who died the day after the raid. The raid of the newspaper is recounted in a federal lawsuit filed Wednesday by Deb Groover, a reporter for the paper. She's suing Marion Police Chief Gideon Cody, saying he didn't have the right to snatch her personal phone out of her hand. In the lawsuit, Groover's attorneys call the raid shocking, unprecedented, and unconstitutional. At one point, the court documents say while the police raid continued for 3+ hours, Record staff were forced to wait outside in temperatures that had reached 100 degrees. The lawsuit goes on to accuse the chief of acting in unreasonable and unnecessarily violent fashion, causing injury to Groover. Groover is seeking at least $75,000 in damages, as well as a jury trial. Groover and her attorney provided statements to us Wednesday. Groover's attorney saying in part that Deb Groover is not the one to target for a violation of fundamental constitutional rights. She will fight for herself and her fellow journalists. Groover herself is also weighing in, saying, "I'm standing up for journalists across the country. It is our constitutional right to do this job without fear of harassment or retribution, and our constitutional rights are always worth fighting for."
And this is certainly a story that has captivated those of us in the news media. We've had conversations in my newsroom about let's make sure that we're covering this as objective observers, not as folks who are somehow involved. But I have to wonder if you guys as representatives, as lawmakers, are hearing from constituents the same things that we're hearing as media about all of this. Are you hearing about it at all from your constituents?
I haven't heard that much from my constituency in regards to it. I mean, obviously, we've been seeing it on the news programs, and it made national news in regards to what happened with the Marion Record. But I haven't been hearing from my constituents, no.
Okay. What about you, John?
The only constituent that I've heard from on this issue is constituent number one. That's my wife. On Saturday morning after this happened, she was reading the electronic newspaper and said, "You're not going to believe this." And I didn't believe
Well,
it.
and that's what I would
shocked.
say. We've had conversations about what happened with the Marion record, but if there's, if it's generating a concern.
Right. I have not seen a groundswell from constituents. Now, I've heard from freedom of the press type organizations, but no, I've not received a lot of contact. Other than my wife, I can't think of any other constituent who's contacted me on the issue.
Okay.
Maybe that tells us something, and I'm not sure it tells us something good either. Freedom of the press is important.
Well, it's very important, and what I've been hearing is it was just unconscionable of what happened.
Yeah.
And we can't really, in a way, can't even believe that there was a raid on a newspaper office. That's what I've been hearing. But as far as, what are we going to do when we go back to Topeka, there hasn't been any outreach yet on that.
Okay. Well, and Diane, I know you and I both covered this to one extent or another. This is the first lawsuit. Indubitably, we're going to be seeing more.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question of that. I've known Deb Groover for many years. I used to sit next to her in the Eagle, and Deb Groover is probably the last person in America where you want to grab her cell phone out of her hand. She's not going to take that, and she's just the first of many. And this whole situation was just flat unconscionable. I mean, this was an illegal raid. There's no question in my mind about it.
All right.
And by the way, Deb was my constituent before she went to Marion, and she was an involved constituent then. And I seriously doubt that this is about the money for Deb Gruber, but she's got one of the finest lawyers in the state representing her, and the people in Marion need to be concerned about this because I fear it's going to cost somebody some money.
And certainly, you represent smaller towns in your district, Troy. Handling the sort of payouts that we may be seeing from this is really going to hit a small town hard.
Oh, it could put them under. Yeah. If you look at the 5 counties that I represent, one entity owns 4 of those newspapers that go out on a weekly basis. And if they were hit with, numerous litigation and found guilty and had to, pay, the cities, the counties, it would cost them a lot if it was the same thing happened with the newspapers.
I have represented small municipalities in Kansas under similar circumstances. Most of them do have insurance coverage for this, and I understand that they have outside counsel now for both the county and the city. There's also the Kansas Tort Claims Act, which limits a lot of recoveries to no more than $500,000, and typically cities are insured for these types of amounts. Now, there are exceptions in federal civil rights cases where there could be verdicts in excess of that, but there's also immunity issues and a whole host of other things we probably don't have time to discuss today. Still, in a community
that I represent, let's say a city of 2,000 people, even $500,000 would have a huge impact if they had to pay that claim.
But my presumption is that your city, like most cities, does purchase insurance for that type of an unfortunate eventuality.
But
not everybody does.
But something like this would make it very hard to buy insurance
in the future
going forward.
Yeah.
Well, and that's part of what we hope is the deterrent effect in the law of making people responsible financially for the damages that they incur. And insurance mitigates that effect sometimes, but overall the insurance market, part of what this does is it gets people's attention. It says, don't do these sorts of things. There is a financial consequence.
And we're going to leave that discussion there. Okay. Moving on, Kansas has more sunshine in a given year than the actual sunshine state, and energy companies want to capture some of that power. But more and more counties are saying, we don't want that kind of energy where we live. We go back to Jackson Overstreet for a look at the latest set of county-level restrictions that pretty much ban solar farms.
If you drive through the Flint Hills, you'll see waves of prairie grass all around you. It's that prairie grass that Butler County residents are eager to protect.
The Flint Hills are beautiful. We have a lot to appreciate and promote.
Tuesday, the Butler County Commission listened.
All in favor, say aye. Aye.
passing new regulations for solar farms that will ban any from being built in the majority of the county. These changes were in response to a project that was proposed back in April.
We didn't really have any rules and regs in place at the time, and this was a very large solar farm, about a 500 million farm with I think over 1 million panels.
A lot of residents in the Lincoln Township just north of El Dorado did not want a solar farm around their homes, as well as covering the native grass that is all over the area.
Agriculture is the primary industry here in Butler County, and a lot of the prairie grass would go away, affecting the cattle industry and the ability to produce livestock.
County Commissioner Kelly Herzit says the planning board has been working for months on these rules, getting resident and business feedback to find a compromise. He thinks in the end, all of that paid off.
Now we have rules and regs in place to cover the smaller ones, the middle-sized ones, and even a large one that might want to come in the county.
And it seems to me we started seeing this with wind farms, more and more rural communities saying, you know what, we don't want it here. We're concerned about various different things. And now we're seeing it almost immediately with solar farms. Think solar farms kind of paying the price for wind farms, or is it just in general a case of folks are like, you know what, we just want to be left alone at this point? Any ideas? You're in rural Kansas, right?
Yeah, and actually I have to, when I was, hearing about what was going on in Butler County in regards to the solar farm, actually in June, we just had an announcement that in Russell County, just east of the city of Russell, they're going to be building a solar farm there, and it was kind of welcomed.
Okay.
So they're going to convert 140 acres that they have secured from a local farmer. And he and his family were there at the announcement, and they had the energy companies, they had county commissioners, county employees, legislators. I mean, it was a very welcomed event. So that's why I'm kind of wondering, what the regulations that they put into place in Butler County, where he said it would, impede to small, middle, and large solar farms. So I'm kind of, intrigued exactly what those regulations are. I don't know if solar farms has become the victim because of wind farms. I represent Lincoln County, and Lincoln County has wind turbines. Now there are some that do not like seeing the wind turbines or the blinking lights at night. But then if you're the landowner and you receive the royalty,
No.
it's not too bad.
Or you can be like my family, who lives on the opposite side of the road from where the royalties are being paid. They get to see the turbine,
they're the one,
but they don't receive any money. And my guess is that if the wind turbines were on their side of the road, they would probably have been more supportive of the idea.
But the same thing with an oil pumping unit.
Absolutely.
If it's on your property, you don't mind that pumping on your land because you're getting that.
Dion has written, though, on the situation out in Quivira, I think, wildlife, where it's kind of a different issue, and it's something we got to take into account. And he could tell us a lot better than I could. But,
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the solar panels for a second here, because this isn't the first county that did this. Sedgwick County has had these regulations in place for years. I couldn't even tell you how many years because it was so long ago. And so I think we're seeing kind of an urban-rural sort of split. I think these would probably be more acceptable out in rural areas where, like you say, they can use the extra commerce. And, within the metropolitan area, I think the thing to do would be to have a more personalized experience with solar power.
What did Sedgwick County put into place as far as regulations? Did it impede?
They basically banned them.
Basically banned. Is that what Butler County did as well?
Their justification for it was all the airports around here was that it would reflect off the eyes of the pilots coming into the air base or Jabara or.
Although we actually do have some solar generation. Sedgwick County Electric Co-op out at Cheney has a small solar farm adjacent to a substation.
Yeah.
And nobody that I know is complaining about
Right,
that.
and I think Mays High School does
Mays,
too.
I was about to say,
Right.
Mays High School
But,
has one. I walk by it every day.
But
There
those
are-
are pretty
right.
small scale. I mean, those
Yeah.
aren't the big industrial scale solar
Yeah,
farms.
But
this is
I
going to have
think-
a million panels. Is that right?
Well,
Something like
that was a
yeah.
description we heard in one of those stories, but I think the concern in Butler County is defacing the Flint Hills with large
Right.
solar farms. But it's a good example of, I believe, something that local control is probably the right way to go. Let counties determine these things through zoning, let them tailor the response to whatever their communities think is the best. And if the commissioners don't do what their constituents like, then they will answer for it at the polls of the next election. And it leaves Troy and I out of the mix. Nobody comes after us. We blame it on the county.
I'm all for local control. So.
Well, talking about control, we're talking about clean energy, solar energy. I mentioned wind energy, and we know Evergy has used the push toward clean energy for years as the reason for why it's so expensive compared to surrounding states. And this last week, we had a case where the KCC basically told Evergy, you know what, that increase you wanted, you're not getting it.
Well, technically, the staff recommended that. So the commissioners will still make the final decision on that. But then today, Evergy and the KCC issued an order, and they have agreed after 2 years of haggling and 10 years after the state law was passed to allow it, to start doing energy conservation programs. And we are 30 years behind the rest of the country in energy conservation. We are number 49 out of the 50 states for energy conservation. Thank God for Wyoming, because otherwise that could be really embarrassing. So it's just the future's calling, and whatever way you generate power, it is going to generate an impact on somebody. There is no free lunch here. You got to look at the wind turbines, you got the solar panels flashing in your eyes, or you got a coal plant, blowing smoke on you. So it's like, what do you do?
Yep.
Pick your poison.
Pick your poison.
As much as I do believe that generation creates climate change, and I think we're seeing examples of it with hurricanes, etc., I've also now come to recognize, though, that without the coal plants that we have in Kansas, we would not have had enough electricity last week and the week before. We had 3 days inside of 1 week that set new records for the Southwest Power Pool. And unfortunately, when the wind doesn't blow, those wind turbines don't produce the electricity. And when you need it on a hot afternoon in Kansas, you've got to have coal plants, you've got to have nuke plants, you've got to have natural gas, because we can't import enough energy from other sources to supply the demand or the load in Kansas without those plants. And so it's a tough...
And the KCC has approved years ago exporting wind energy to the Eastern Power Pool.
Absolutely. And for the most part, it is Kansas power going out of state. But ironically, last weekend or the week before, we were, for the first time since Winter Storm Uri, importing power from what's called MISO, which is basically the grid that is to the north and east of us now. For the most part, it's been the other way around, and in fact, Evergy was selling power, excess power generated in Kansas at wholesale for less than they charge, obviously, their customers in Kansas, too. That's very concerning.
All right. Well, of course, all that sunshine we were talking about, that can also be too much of a good thing sometimes. Without enough rain, the majority of central Kansas remains under moderate to extreme drought conditions. And now, KSN's Craig Andrus shows us there are concerns this year's drought could be harming next year's crops.
At the Kirkpatrick farm, they're happy to even have a corn harvest this year, considering the drought.
In this game, you've always got to have hope. So we trust the guy upstairs to do what's right for us. So.
Dwayne says it helps to have faith the rains will come when the last 2 years have been so dry.
We've moved to strictly no-till to save as much moisture as we can.
No-till helps keep in moisture, and that's important to Matt Kirkpatrick. He farms with his father, but he's also a soil analyst.
But the microorganisms and stuff that live in the soil have to have water just like any living thing.
Matt says there's a big concern now with this extended drought. Different strains of bacteria in the soils will now take a long time to regenerate, and some farmers don't want to skip a year waiting for income from the farm while that soil regenerates.
This year we had zero subsoil moisture going into spring, which usually we rely on really heavily on, especially for corn crops.
On top of soil issues, down the road, the soybean crop in so many areas is drying and dying.
It's been really depressing the last couple weeks as we drive around and the fields just keep getting worse and worse. A lot of the soybeans won't get harvested at all.
And once again, Troy, I'm going to start with you. You are a farmer as well as a lawmaker.
I work for my dad and my uncle on our farming operation.
Yeah, you're dealing with this on a daily basis right now.
Yes. In fact, yesterday we're no-till farmers. And so I was on the sprayer yesterday, getting the land ready for us to plant wheat. But the drought is having a dire effect. Obviously, we had one of the lowest wheat harvests in decades this last summer. That's cascading into the fall crops. Milo, the soybeans, as they mentioned in there, is burning up. But also the other factor that not only talking about the commodities, when you're talking about grains, but it's also having an impact on ranching, because you're not having the brome to get hay bales or alfalfa or feed. And so that's going to be an issue during the winter months, when that's what you use to feed your herds, and that's actually having an issue as well. I mean, we were just talking about what are we going to do with our cattle herd, because we're not going to have the hay and the feed bales that we had in the past.
And what affects a farmer in Kansas or the rancher affects the rest of us.
Well, another thing that's significant here is I used to always think of this as a, quote, west of 81 problem. But if you look at that map that was up there, it shows a big dark spot over Chautauqua County, Kansas. And they're supplied out of the Boy Scout Lake at Quivira Scout Ranch. It is down so far now that they're within 2 to 3 foot of no more water. And they've been in a Class 3 water emergency there for the past month and a half. Majority of their water use, or large part, is watering cattle. And so this is becoming a much broader problem than at least what traditionally I had thought of. It's a statewide problem.
Well, and agriculture is the #1 industry in the state of Kansas. We have 60,000 farms, and it'll have an impact on the Kansas economy.
Absolutely.
And we're going to leave that there because we are out of time. Thank you so much, Troy, Diane, John, for joining us, and thank you as well. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, KSN News, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. We hope you've enjoyed the show. For now, stay safe and have a great week.